So thank you all for coming to our forum this afternoon to discuss the potential changes to the draft review of conservation zones in the Pittwater LGA. The purpose of this forum is to try and get a better result for Pittwater in terms of nature conservation, protection of visual quality and scenic character of the natural and built environment into the future for our local government area. Council has sent letters to those residents currently living in a conservation zone and are seeking your feedback on the criteria they have set to justify change zonings. Have they got the methodology and criteria in assessing your property right? There are so many reasons as to why we live in Pittwater, whether we are renting, visiting for a while, or choose to invest our hard-earned dollars in a home here. The one unifying reason that we have chosen to live in Pittwater would have to be that we appreciate the vastly beautiful landscape. We have the Pittwater, a magnificent unspoilt coastline, lagoons, wetlands and tree canopies climbing up to tree-lined ridges. Most of us, when purchasing our homes, spend time to research the zoning of the land, giving the prospective purchaser peace of mind in the regulations that may or may not be permissible in that area. We have been living comfortably with these zonings until now. This peace of mind that we may have enjoyed could be severely disrupted if Council's proposal to rezone extensive tracts of land in Pittwater from C4 to R residential goes ahead. I have purposely called it R because it is very unclear just what the R zone would be for some areas. Council has said that most properties will fall into an R2 low density residential zone, but how are we to make an informed decision on the reclassification of our land if all the facts are not before us? Council is proposing to rezone 3,613 properties from a C4 zoning into residential zoning, and some properties will move from an R zone into a C3 classification where hazards have been identified. This means there are an overall reduction of 2,285 properties currently listed as C4 zoned. This is a reduction of conservation zone lands in Pittwater of 50% plus. 7,447 properties will have a C classification and 9,347 properties will now be exposed to regulations in an R zone. The suburb of Mona Vale will see a reduction of approximately 75% of its lands formerly classified as Conservation 4 rezoned to residential. A similar story for other suburbs in our LGA. Where has the pressure for such drastic changes to our LEP come from? The Department of Planning has apparently told Council that previous criteria used for assessing conservation zones was too conservative and has said that scenic quality cannot be relied upon to inform decisions around being given a C3 or a C4 zone. And why change the terminology when a land classification of the former environmental living was a good fit for land usage in urban Pittwater? What does a pen pusher in Macquarie Street know about Pittwater? We cannot let the state government dictate the way in which we wish to live and for the men and women in suits to erode our planning regulations. We understand from council meetings that Northern Beaches Council is on target to meet its housing targets, building in and around town and village centres. So why target so much of our conservation zoned land? Our current zonings have for many years protected Pittwater from unsympathetic development. And we hear that Council is looking for a consistent approach in planning across the Northern Beaches Council area, but why are we in Pittwater being asked to surrender so much? But I think point 6 needs to be highlighted in that the local strategy towards 2040, which the community felt comfortable with, does not align with what we're being asked to do in terms of our conservation zones. I think that it is important at this point to highlight the fact that Pittwater, prior to amalgamation, had one of the most up-to-date LEPs in the metropolitan area. The 2014 LEP that came into effect on the 27th of June that year preceded the 1993 Pittwater Local Environment Plan after 21 years of usage. The community's input strongly supported the preservation and enhancement of the natural environment. Amalgamation took place in 2016, and the new combined LEP, which this review will feed into, is planned to go out to public comment by 2023, a mere 7-year difference. There seems to be a big rush to get this done by the state government, but that could have enormous consequences to our community if these changes to zonings are to proceed to this degree. And it is clear when reviewing the mapping for all 3 LGAs that Pittwater had large areas given to environmental living status compared to the Manly and Warringah local government areas. The Pittwater LEP reflected the community's desire to maintain the character of the area. In preparing for this review, Council were keen to hear the community's views on what was important to them, and this is what they said. So they wanted consultation with the community, support for protection of the environment, wildlife corridors should be prioritised and protected, that we wanted corridors, tree cover, waterways, bushfire were all important environmental values in Pittwater, that we should maintain existing C4 zones, protect existing C2 zoned land, and the list goes on. But I think the big one there is, well, one of the large ones, is that we wanted to maintain existing C4 zoning in Pittwater. Conservation zones are relevant in urbanised areas, yet many of these points above are not being given due consideration in this review. Vegetated gardens act as the last bastion for urban wildlife and their movements through the landscape. In fact, Mosman Council is going in the complete opposite direction of this draft review and converting land from R2 to C4 to protect and enhance the scenic protection area, and they have a foreshore protection zone in place. We should insist on a foreshore protection zone to be included in our LEP from the shoreline to our ridgelines. The former Manly Council also has a shoreline protection zone, or foreshore protection zone. In the 1970s, Warringah Council obtained an exemption from state government policy to allow medium density housing in all residential areas by establishing that land had been zoned for units, townhouses and villas, but that established further density increases could not be sustained by the inadequate road network, aided and abetted by natural hazards such as vulnerability to landscape, fire, flooding and coastal erosion, a lack of infrastructure generally. It is clear from this piece of history that pressure has always been present when it comes to increasing housing stock in the LGA. Vast tracts of land currently under review to be rezoned residential from C4 are along narrow local road systems, and due to the extreme weather events that we have been experiencing, are in poor condition. Has the review got it right in considering this in terms of access, one of the criteria for change to the zoning? The State Environmental Planning Policy for Housing, amended in 2022, will allow medium density housing and seniors living to be built in R2 zones. Council is still in discussions with the state government regarding this and possible exemptions to the code. However, it seems contradictory that Council is claiming in the draft review that changing from a C4 zone to an R zone will not increase population in the area. Council and consultants have set the criteria within the zones as to what is and is not permissible, and the Council has the discretion to add and remove additional permitted uses if it wishes. They can also add extra zone objectives and have leeway with regard uses permitted. Now it will be possible to build hospitals, goodness, we've just pulled one down, medical facilities, electricity generating works, school-based childcare, churches, emergency service facilities, exhibition homes, veterinary hospitals, attached and detached dual occupancies, to name just a few. There seems to be too many urban uses within a C4 zone. Has council got this right, or should the permitted uses be reduced? This map here shows you the changes to the zoning, and we now see the hot pink areas, which were C4, which would now be designated residential zones. And as you can see from the south of the Pittwater LGA, all of the southern section of Mona Vale could be handed over to residential. Vast tracts of Whale Beach, Palm Beach, the very top of Bilgola Plateau, and a big bunched area around Newport in the northern part of Mona Vale. So it's a drastic change. In Pittwater, we are very fortunate to be able to immerse ourselves in a very high quality scenic landscape. You cannot help have your spirits lifted by what is around you. People come from far and wide to enjoy so many aspects of the natural environment and vistas here. Yet the scenic value of the landscape has been completely omitted from this draft conservation review, overlooking the very essence of the Pittwater local government area. With Pittwater having a large cohort of people working from home, I would imagine that working in nature would be an absolute benefit to their working day. Due to the ancient geography of Pittwater, there are still a great many vegetated timbered ridgelines. However, a lot of these will potentially move to a residential zoning, keeping in mind that 800 square metres is all that is required for a dual occupancy to be built, and many block sizes on Pittwater's ridgelines are much larger than this. Whilst driving around Pittwater, it is not difficult to find a massive dig out of the hillside, the beginnings of another concrete bunker. If this is allowed to happen in a conservation zone, then heaven help us once zoned residential. The character statements in our development control plans for each suburb throughout Pittwater are still very valid documents and should be read in consultation with potential changes to the zonings. The bushland landscape viewed from our coastlines and bays is the predominant feature of Pittwater, with the built form being the secondary component of the visual catchment. However, if you look at properties on a ridgeline which have been classified with a medium value environmental criteria, the weighting for biodiversity, urban tree canopy, on slopes of 15 to 25 degrees on a ridgeline or escarpment have been reduced to a weighting of just 0.5 rather than 1 as all other weightings. Why is this? This weighting must be increased to 1 for it to make any sense. So this explains some of the criteria, and you can see by the second last line that 50% or more of the site is affected. We'd like to see that number drastically reduced, and for weightings, particularly for the escarpments and ridgelines, to be increased. In closing, I hope that this has given you some food for thought, and that you make use of Council's very good interactive mapping on the Your Say page on Council's website, that you request a site visit from Council, and that you, more importantly, make a submission. Let us together protect the scenic value of Pittwater and all the great things that help to make up the rich and healthy environment in which we all live. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcia. I'll hand you straight over to Craig Burton. Some of you may remember Craig from Anna's rally a couple of months ago. You are an architect, a landscape architect, a historian. What don't you do? But you're also an avid, passionate man about the environment, and we thank you for that, and we're so happy Anna actually found your work in the library. So to talk about the values that are often undervalued in this modern planning world, Craig.
Thank you. And I just wonder if we ought not to acknowledge that we're on Gadigal lands of the Darug Nation and pay our respects to them. Because I don't think any of the so-called conservation zones acknowledge culture or much at all. This is a 6 maps view of the northern beaches, and it looks decidedly different from the conservation zone maps. And I wonder, is that because they may have been produced in America or not, or in cyberspace, some strange position. And there's a lack of understanding of the place. And I think I showed this slide at the last talk as well, but you can see that the white patches there, they're just from Manly all the way up. They're the sort of urban centres that are partly industrial. And the current zoning maps, or the proposed zoning maps, and I can't call them conservation plans because they're not conservation plans. They're not conservation zonings, they're development plans. And they want everything as urban. And so everything goes into that pathological white tone you see on the aerial photograph. And so this juggernaut of development is coming from the current state government, and I've experienced that elsewhere in Sydney and in New South Wales, whereas the current planning minister, development is good at any price, and what price the environment. And so Northern Beaches Council, to my mind, is just being forced by their political masters to toe the line. And I'm sure that this is the plan that's just been shown as well, but that pink colour on the coast going up into Bayview is all urban. And this is completely unsustainable. But it's something that's coming from maybe the present Minister of Planning, who is pushing urban development as some kind of saviour. And it's totally inappropriate. And I would think that if I was on the staff of the planning staff of Northern Beaches Council, I'd be embarrassed to show this. It's even embarrassing to talk about it because it's so dumb. Any increase in density needs a fast transport system. And Rob Stokes gave us the beeline. But no amount of beeline will get you people up and down the peninsula with just only one road in and one road out. There's massive problems with waste, massive problems with car movements now. So what are they thinking? I don't think they think at all. So this is just carte blanche for the mates of the state government to move in and develop the hell out of this place.
Yes.
It's kind of intriguing that you could say, oh look, you've got a national park there, let's make the whole Barrenjoey Peninsula urban. It balances off very nicely. And I live in Scotland Island and Church Point. I have a double existence. But I've been 51 years on the north side of Scotland Island. I look at the national park and I quite like looking at it. I look at the Barrenjoey Peninsula and I still quite like looking at it, but not if it's urban. I think that's, it's sacrilegious. And so I don't think these people have thought things through, and I don't think the council's thought things through very well. And now I'll backpedal a little bit, and I was involved in 1988 and 89, as some of you may know, to do the heritage study for the succession of Pittwater from Warringah. And this is one of the drawings. I haven't shown this drawing before. which looks at landscape types. So that when you look at the detail, those sort of dark, blotchy areas are natural vegetation or have some specific ecological value. And they're differentiated from the hatched colour or the hatched tone, because the hatched tone is residential, and the others are open space parks. And this kind of differentiation is not occurring in the conservation zone plannings, or can I still call them development zones? Because it doesn't recognise the detail. And it's been mentioned about the significance or the visual quality of the natural landscape. And the fact that this area that I've toned in, and this is in 1988, with a horizontal hatching, is largely treed. And do we need to lose all of the trees for urban development and higher density? I don't think so. So that's why I don't think they understand what they're doing. The people who have prepared these plans, and also the people that are trying to implement them. And we've got to watch the link between the state government and the merged councils. And we know they're both up for re-election, so I think we need to get rid of them both. And I'll show you what I mean by landscape type. So this is just a map, of course, but a landscape type is an area of land that has some sort of integrity visually. And there may be other things associated with that. There may be cultural things associated with it. There may be Indigenous people, Indigenous cultures, there may be European cultures or whatever that comes out in understanding the history and understanding the place. And that's not demonstrated in these recent plans. This is an aerial oblique shot over Mona Vale and Pittwater to the west, which is an estuary. And to the right is the Tasman Sea, which is an ocean. Now the plans, the development plans, or the so-called conservation zones, and I must say, this is a habit that the New South Wales government's getting into, is calling things conservation, so it appears green, it appears good. It's all just super development, and there's nothing conserved at all except the developers' bank balance. So when you look at this, you see some obvious differences. You see at Scotland Island, where I am, it's quite dark, it's vegetated, but there's a lot of houses there. There's no sewage. There's septic tanks. It's affecting the quality of the water of Pittwater, as it is now, let alone rezoning. And in many ways, it's very suburban. And so even in the suburban areas, there is a sense of tree cover. But when you get to Mona Vale, the village and the industrial area, it's quite different colour and it's quite different texture. It's what I call the pathological thing. And now I'm not against development. I think development can be if it's very creative, and it's got to be better for all the people that live in the place. And that I often say to students, like, there's three things you have to think about when you're looking at landscapes, inverted commas. And the three interactions are geology, the geological structure of a place, and then the climate, and we know that climate changes all the time, and the third element is the human. And I don't think any of these proposed conservation plans address any of those points. So that they've completely steered away from landscape and only considered objects. And in fact, the last heritage review in the 2000s for Pittwater, I think there was 3 or 4 trees nominated. Everything else was a building and a curb or whatever, or a monument. So it's just objects and not systems. And the one we did in 88, 89 put the landscape first. So you can see the difference between a coastal beach and the estuarine edge of Pittwater. And Pittwater used to be called the lake because it was so calm. compared to the ocean, which is quite violent and high energy. And so you can see the waves, you can see the beach, you can see the sandy beaches. And some of the sandy beaches are hard to pick out in Pittwater, but you can pick up intertidal zones where it's a bit muddy, coming off the Narrabeen geology. So you have the Narrabeen 280 million years old, and then you have the Hawkesbury over the top of that, 230 million years old. And in only a short time we've managed to destroy it. And so the idea of landscape types is like you can see the golf course, and I'd say that's largely open space, but it's recreational. You can start to see how I've mapped these things out. And this kind of looking hasn't gone on in these conservation zone proposals. It needs to go further. So, you know, if you lose all of vegetation, what do you get? Urban development like the industrial area of Monavale? Or could it be more creative? Could you put some controls into the DCP that keep the buildings below the highest natural tree line? Can you keep a percentage of indigenous flora and fauna? Can you conserve rock outcrops and so forth? So what you get with these plans is you don't get anything about what they want to conserve. It's all about what are the proposed uses. So the zone is a proposed use. And where we are at Church Point, where it's going to be C3, and everyone goes, wow, that's pretty good, but we're right next to a residential. And so it depends if it's 7 stories or 5 stories or what, and then you lost the view of Pittwater. and our permitted use is, apart from places of worship, is oyster farming. And we're 50 metres up from the water level. So maybe in Texas they know something more about sea level rise and climate change than we do. And exactly that, it's quite laughable. You know what I mean? And I said to my wife, well, I'm looking forward to getting some oysters growing on the roof. Because the ones in Pittwater will be so polluted because of the urban development, it won't be worth eating. Much nicer on it. But now, this is a view from one of our houses in Church Point. And you can't tell me that there's no tree cover on the peninsula. And that could be the worst case, because there's a whole series of Northern Beaches approved developments, which there's one on the far left with no trees at all. A very expensive proposal. So maybe you extrapolate that all the way through, so you get this incredibly dense Italian hill town, or a piece of Sicily, and no trees. So as romantic as that seems, I don't think that the developers are capable of good design. And we'd like to think so, but I'm not buying it. There are still a lot of trees there, so there's got to be a DCP to conserve the trees in what is now zoned urban. All of that background, and we're looking through trees next to our property. Pittwater is always framed by trees. The natural landforms, and then the water plane of Pittwater, and sometimes a sneak view of the ocean in a low-lying area such as Mona Vale or Careel Bay. And this shot I took above, on the ridge top above Avalon. And you can't tell me, we know there's a lot of houses there, but there's a lot of tree cover. And if you change this to urban, there's no trees. That's got that potential. So I find this whole thing rather stupid. And it relies on careful consideration. And I'm sure that's not going to happen. Because if you've just got a carte blanche movement of developers from the mates of the State Liberal Party straight through into the peninsula, you'll get what the rest of Sydney looks like, and I've been fighting them out on southwestern Sydney, and it's very depressing. And I'd love to name them, but I won't. And it's the same old tired people. And Mr. Murray has a lot to answer for, in my opinion. So you can't tell me that that doesn't look any good, and that's the way it is now. So why can't we have a DCP that protects this tree cover, allows for creative development and pockets and that make wonderful environments for people to live and enjoy? I don't get it. If it were left to the market, it'll be disaster. This is going back to my maps again, but this is the map that I did for the 1988-89 heritage study. And I think that those of you that weren't here last time, I could briefly explain that there was a line, a scenic line, and they said, could you review the scenic line? And it's incredibly unusual in a heritage study to think like this, and I think always visually. I'm always interested in the visual quality, and I think that we're right, that it's the landscape which is the heritage of Pittwater and the northern beaches. So I rejected a foreshore line and made an area which it's the most seen area from public places and Pittwater, and I made Pittwater significant, the water body itself. And there's a whole host of recommendations, which I understand that Pittwater Online is interested in publishing again, so many years later. None of the recommendations were picked up by any council to date. And this now needs revising, so I've started to rethink it a little bit. And it's that hatched area that says this should all be conservation. And so think of it like we're going to have the Barrenjoey National Park, the Barrenjoey Peninsula National Park, but we're going to live in it, we're going to play in it, we're going to enjoy ourselves in it. There can be creative development. You don't need just blanket high density, medium density, or whatever you want to justify, because somebody needs to get so many houses per year from the state government. They're already destroying the Cumberland Plain to meet that target anyway. So I'm thinking that, yes, you can have development in those white areas, but it should be controlled by DCP in the LEP. And perhaps this could be more structured, to include the sort of bay view and then the peninsula. At the time of doing this heritage study, we were limited by Monavale Road as the boundary. At that stage, Pittwater hadn't been defined properly, but this was Warringah quite rightly by the then really good planners at Warringah, that we're thinking ahead to see what we can conserve. So this is about conservation, not about development. And I think this is the sort of thing that we need to feed into or replace the plans that they're putting up. So this is a true conservation plan, not a fake one. So I started to redraw it the other night with the contours, and then you see the dotted lines are the ridges. And the ridges, and then you get the definition of catchments. So within every catchment, and then you get drainage lines. Look, that's Avalon going down into Cooreel Bay. So I haven't put the roads on. I haven't put my knowledge of the Indigenous sites on, but neither have the people from Houston. And this is starting to redefine my mapping of 1988. And I would think that within areas you can have different catchments, and the community that lives in that catchment then controls the nature of development by negotiation. The DCP sets out so much percentage tree canopy, Indigenous plants, conservation of rock outcrops, and so forth. But then each person that lives in one of those catchments can then say, we're affected by your proposal, overshadowing or lack of air, or not enough birds anymore, or the quality of the water's deteriorated since you moved in. Can we talk about this, work it out? So everybody becomes a custodian for the environment. And that's what's lacking. So here we're just going south again. So this covered the same area as in the proposed conservation zones. I can't even talk about it because it's not a conservation zone. Nowhere in the documents does it say what they're conserving. It's only what you can build. And it's it'll be a carte blanche for the developers and the mates of the state government. Make no mistake about that. I'm seeing it happening in the Cumberland Plain at a very fast rate and pushing people out. People are moving interstate, and people won't move for floods, they'll move because of the juggernaut of this government. So it's capable, if I'm to do this very quickly, it's capable of the so-called planners to do that as well. And then you overlay that with the ecology and the vegetation, and there's an amazing amount of green cover in the existing residential. We want to conserve that. So, it's crazy to colour it all in purple. Thanks, John. But this is quite a big drawing, so I'm sorry it sort of reads a bit fuzzy, but I just wanted to show you the mechanism for trying to understand the place, which hasn't gone on in these zoning maps. The other thing that's missing for me is the cultural aspect, both the Indigenous culture and the European culture. And this slide is a section of parish map, 1906. That's when Scotland Island was first subdivided for sale, after the great-granddaughter of Bungaree was moved off and had to move into Bayview. She's probably looking for an apartment. So there is a history about the land dealings and the subdivision patterns and the roads and all that, which is embedded in the heritage study. And so there's a bit of pride in that as well. So you've got to understand that layer of culture. Now this is the Green Hill. This is Newport, 1886. Vast areas were burnt by Indigenous cultures. And, I don't get on with Bill Gamage, but I completely agree with him. And it's just a personal thing. When Lieutenant Dawes came here, in the very early part of the settlement, he said the whole of the Barrenjoey area, what is now the Barrenjoey Peninsula, was suitable for sheep farming. And you go, what? But when you look at the old drawings and the paintings, there's masses of grass. There's been clearing and burning to help with bushfire. It also promotes food. And as we know, the Indigenous caretaking of the land is far greater than us. So this is one of many slides I could show you. This is the whole of that Newport Hill, which has been burnt regularly. And the same is true at Scotland Island. The same is true many parts around Pittwater. I could keep you bored senseless for days showing you images of a collective of slides of vast areas that have been burnt. And that made it a very palatable place to stay and live and develop. But we don't want them to develop too much. And so perhaps in terms of fire, we should go back to the Indigenous, the cultural burning. And I think that's right across Australia that's starting to become a valued thought. And this is a 1912 image of Bilgola House, Bilgola Beach. It was cleared around. There's a very heath vegetation happening. And back into the valley you get what I call wet gully flora. You get cabbage tree palms. You get other plants that love that sort of wet gully environment. Now all of these are in danger of being lost under urban development. All of this area is coloured in pink. I mean, the Gola people are distraught. I had a separate meeting with one of them and they're absolutely distraught. So there always has been a sense of naturalness, and I think I'm not opposed to development, but it has to be the right side of development for me, but to keep the sense of naturalness, and that's a challenge for the DCP and the LEP. This is Mr. Johnson's 1927 painting from Palm Beach, across Stokes Point, across Scotland Island to Bayview. 1927, you can still have the tree cover. There was quite a bit of development in the 1920s. That's when the real estate thinking really started to get going in Pittwater. And, but, you know, the landscape is there, and that's the naturalness of the landscape is important. Even if you don't know the names of every tree, you don't know the names of all the flora and the fauna, it's ever present, and the naturalness is one of the great attributes. And it's the reason why Ku-ring-gai Chase was established as a national park for its scenic wonder in 1894 by Eggleston Dufar. And we still have to think like that. And I also, as said before in the previous meeting, if you imagine the Lakes District in the UK, which is a national park, but it supports towns and communities and farming and tourism and all sorts of things, this can be integrated into this landscape. We don't have to obliterate it with urban design as a smart tool. And then this is Margaret Olley's sketch from the 1960s, and I thought, yes, you know, this is on the Pittwater side of the peninsula, looking across to Scotland Island, and I've actually worked on this place, but it's a very it's small and it's subservient to the landscape, and it just sits in there calmly. And there are ways of densing the development up, but still keeping that quality. You don't have to obliterate it. You've got to have vision. So we need the council with vision, we need a state government with vision, and a community with vision. And this is, again, the importance of landscape. This is, I think the date of this is about 1903. Looking along the ridge of Palm Beach, Sunrise Hill, Barrenjoey Peninsula, West Head on the left, bits of Pittwater, and looking out to Lion Island, and then the ocean on the right. All of this is zoned urban under the current proposals. Crazy. Thank you.
Sure, thank you very much. And it's wonderful to see so many people here, and it's wonderful to see all these pictures of Pittwater. You're going to see a few pictures of Mossman, and you'll probably be thinking, oh my God, such a lot of development, right? Because really, development is about making your place as you want it to be. And really, you've got sort of challenges in Pittwater. We've also had challenges in Mossman, because I guess I'm also not against development, but getting development to be the right development for the area that you want to live in and the sort of character of the area that you want to live in, that's a real challenge, and it's a never-ending challenge. Community planning, Mossman, scenic protection area, and C4 zoning. So I've just got about 3 slides just to tell you the brief story, and I'm happy to answer any questions. We didn't have a scenic protection area before about 2008. So why did we set one up? We set one up because there are things called SEPs, State Environment Planning Instruments, and there's a housing code. And what happens is that the state government doesn't look at sort of Pittwater and Mossman and various other places. It looks at the whole state of New South Wales, and it makes kind of planning instruments that apply across Sydney, certainly. And what that meant was that we couldn't control certain aspects of planning And so what we did was we negotiated with the Department of Planning to set up a scenic protection area. And I don't know whether you can see, but all of that green area around the map is the 60-metre contour line, so 60 metres up from the level of the sea. That's what we set as our scenic protection area. And the key reason that we did that was that we wanted to have some degree of control. And what happens with the state housing code is that you're allowed to have exempt and complying development, which basically means that you can sort of build certain things without even notifying your neighbour, certainly without getting permission from the council. And we just didn't want those, we didn't think that was appropriate for that area. It's now 2022, so that happened like 14 years ago. And we had several extensions. Each time we got an extension, it was a real sort of battle to try and sort of draw it out of the Department of Planning, and talking to local MPs who could be helpful or less helpful. But now what we've got is C4, and it's the criteria for C4 is special aesthetic value. Okay, so I mean you have to sort of decide whether you have got and whether you want to maintain special aesthetic value. So after a long process, we eventually worked out that sort of C4 was the way to go, and we weren't sure. And by the way, I'm speaking for myself, I'm not speaking for the council, I'm an ex-councillor. But we weren't sure whether the community would actually get on board. Because the community might think, oh no, we want to be able to sort of develop our property as much as we possibly can. We don't want any controls. But nevertheless, we went out and we sent a letter to all the people who lived in the area. And there were over 2,500 households. And we did Zoom conferences and all kinds of other stuff. We got 219 submissions that we got back, and fortunately, 2/3 of them were in favour of the change to move from R2, which was low density residential, to C4, which is called environmental living. And in fact, the changes, the controls between what we had with R2 and what we've got with C4, the changes were very minimal. The major change in moving to C4 was we were no longer subject to the housing code. We were no longer subject to state government directed, exempt and complying development. That's the main reason why we did it. What we got as a result of our proposal and our consultation, we rezoned 2,418 lots, which are basically the brown areas that you can see in that map. There were 213 which we removed because more than 50% of those lots were actually outside the scenic protection area, so we did include them. But it's not like we've actually invented this and we're the first people ever to do it, because you can see it's currently applied to the residential foreshore areas along Middle Harbour at Cremorne, Camaret, Northbridge, Castle Crag, Middle of Castle Cove, Roseville Chase, and in residential neighbourhoods adjacent to bushland, East Killara, Chatswood, Lane Cove, Linfield, Pimble, St Ives, Turramurra, Warunga. So basically, all councils live under a bit of a straitjacket of rules and a particular development agenda from the state government. And so all of these kind of councils have recognised that C4 is a way to basically maintain some degree of control. Now, I would say that we did R2 to C4. Some of the land is not actually R2, it could be R3, so that would be medium density residential. And we're not allowed to sort of reduce the level of development by rezoning. And so we're still working out what to do with the non-R2 land. So this is the slopes of Balmoral. You can see Balmoral Beach. That white building on the left is Bathers Pavilion. You see the road going up the middle there. I don't know whether you know Mosman at all. That's a Wyber Street. There's actually a run that runs up a Wyber Street. I've done it a couple of times. And when you get to the top, I say, you are really, really ill. Anyway, but as you can see, it's pretty built up. And there's, you can see a sort of 3 or 4 story building kind of on the right hand side of Wyber Street. And you can also see on the ridge line, which is above the scenic protection area, then there's some sort of unit blocks and so on. Anyway, so I'm just saying that development is always a challenge, and this is just one step that we've taken in order to try and better manage development and planning and try and maintain what we wanted to do, which was the dominance of landscape over the built environment, which I don't think that we've quite kind of got there. But I'm just saying that's what we try to do, and it's very difficult to maintain planning controls. You can't really see this one in this particular light, but this is looking into Balgowlah, so it's not Mosman, and there's a couple of developments there. And what we wanted to really avoid, and what actually seems to be happening on this site, is that somebody in front of you develops, right? So your view is gone, and so you want to develop because you've got to see over the top of them, and then the people behind you, they want to develop as well. So it leads to a sort of cascade of development. And this is my mates going kayaking yesterday morning. It was a beautiful day. And again, you can see this is Balgowlah, and well, to me it looks like quite an intense environment of development. But it's a constant challenge from my point of view, and I really wish you every power and success to make sure that your land, your home, is looked after. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to do my acknowledgement to Aboriginal people whose land was never ceded when I started, so sorry I'm doing it at the end. But thank you very much.
Angus was an outstanding general manager of Pittwater Council, and I understand he's an apology to this meeting for health reasons. And I asked him last week, did he have any, because I didn't know, hadn't been in touch with him for a while, so I asked him, did he have any views on this proposal to switch a lot of the C4 zones to residential? And he replied with a very fiery response. And I asked, may I read out what you've just sent me, please, Angus? And he said, no, I think we'd better tone it down a bit. And so what I'm going to read out is what I have been permitted to send on from Angus. And this is what he says. The conservation zoning is supposed to identify 2 matters. 1, areas which should be conserved for environmental reasons, and 2, areas impacted by hazards. The problem is that NBC, our council, does not and never has understood environmental conservation matters. Their view is narrow and shallow. They don't understand the need for tree canopy to allow movement and migration, and he means of fauna. They don't understand canopy from the point of view of place, that is, a concept of houses nestled in trees. You heard that phrase before? And they don't understand conservation in a changing climate, where there needs to be corridors to enable migration of species. From a hazard point of view, says Angus, there is absolutely no understanding of hazards, nor the fact that we should have learnt by now to not intensify development in hazardous areas, and that the community of New South Wales cannot afford past mistakes to be propagated further by the short-term and inappropriate thinking behind the Council's push to enable further intensification in hazardous areas. He says, the Pittwater region has well identified bushfire, flood, coastal erosion and landslip impacted areas. These hazard areas were determined by scientific and detailed studies undertaken over many years. It is criminally irresponsible to rezone any such affected land to enable intensification of development because of the adverse impacts on health, well-being and financial impacts of allowing such intensification. The impacts will not only be on current generations, but also on future generations, particularly in a world in which the climate is changing. I say it is criminal as it totally disregards intergenerational equity and the financial impacts, including the implications for insurance premiums for the overall society, not just those directly impacted, now and into the future. Apart from all the above, he concludes, there seems to be no overall understanding in regard to the infrastructure impacts, roads, water supply, sewerage and power, for example, but this is in line with NBC's small-minded blinkered thinking. Those are Angus's words.
Hi. My question's to Elizabeth. Thank you for coming, trekking out to Pittwater for today. I'm really interested to hear your opinion on what we might be able to do here as concerned residents, apart from, or in addition to, putting in submissions.
This is always the really difficult question. I think just to go back a bit, the problem that you guys are facing, which is essentially how to deal with development pressure and how to deal with population pressure in the face of climate change, is facing, the whole city and the state and the planet. So I think it's actually quite important to try and think about it in that context and recognise that, none of us wants things to change, especially, of course, with places that we love, with places are beautiful. And I think it's unarguable that one of the purposes of planning is to preserve not just amenity, but flavour, the special flavour of particular places. So, and there's a lot of that urge in this room, which is great, and that kind of love is fantastic. But I suppose the conundrum is how to be conscious of that and push that at the same time as understanding that populations are growing, there will be new people, and we have to find a way of making that not a bad thing, unless we're actually arguing to limit world population in some magical way. So we have to understand how to do that and how to deal with climate change at the same time. And I think actually a lot of the answer is to do with design more than planning per se. I mean, rezoning is a favourite instrument of planning and of course of developers, because it tends to deliver windfall gains to developers, which is why they love it at the stroke of a pen. But I think actually it's an argument, especially in a place like this, which is so special and so particular, and its flavour is so unusual, to try to undertake the exercise in a much more minute way and to make it a detailed design exercise where you look at which parts of the place can accommodate and could not just be pushed to accommodate, but benefit from increases in humans, and the ways in which it could be done while still maintaining tree canopy and green cover. For example, applying the rule that Paris has recently instituted, where all roofs have to be either solar covered or green roofs, which would go quite a long way to helping cooling and also the sense of greenness. I think it's one of the reasons that Sydney communities are so development shy is because it's just done so badly here. And one of the reasons for that is what, as people have referred to already, is the sense from government that what you do is you just rezone it and you maybe put on a height limit, but probably you're not terribly serious about that, and then you just let developers do whatever they like, basically. So I think it's an argument for much tighter control, and that's where governments at all levels need to be much more assiduous in how they control and shape and design the environments, and communities really have to, I know this is really hard, push to be involved in that process, in making the rules and setting the rules and accepting them, and not just saying we don't want anything to change, but in saying, and I think this is also a place where the architects and planners amongst you, but especially the architects who are trained to visualise change, could be useful in saying, you know what, we want it to be like this. And this kind of change we're on board with, because it means we have little local community centres and there's walkability, and you know, people can actually live there with a 10-minute walkable lifestyle instead of having to drive everywhere. So that's a good thing, and we all know that that's great for climate change and so on. So I think it's actually an argument for design and for really engaged design as much as anything.
I'd just like to say how impressed I am by how many people have come today, and I think that it actually shows that the Pittwater community has a real sense of custodianship for the land that we actually live on up here. I'd also just like to acknowledge the many members of the community and the residents groups in particular who over the last few weeks, some of whom have been going through the maps provided by the council property by property, checking all the hazard maps as well for each of those properties, so that we can get an overview of what's actually being proposed. And so that's what a lot of the material from today's forum has been based on. But what I'd like to do is, as a councillor, send a very strong message from the community about what people here value. And so we have a petition that we'll try and send out amongst the community, but I'd actually like to propose it as a motion, and I'm hoping that the meeting will support it. So it's basically the wording of the petition, that we, the residents of the Northern Beaches Council area, believe the bushland landscape of the former Pittwater local government area is its predominant feature, with the built form secondary, and that this must be maintained in the future local environment plan and development control plan. We therefore call on Northern Beaches Council in the former Pittwater area to rule out rezoning of C4 land to residential, apply conservation zonings to properties where any significant environmental values or hazards are present, create scenic foreshore protection areas from shorelines to ridgelines, and retain all heritage conservation areas and investigate those proposed but not yet implemented by the former Pittwater Council. So I'm just wondering if we've got a seconder for that motion.
Okay, can we have a vote? Yes. Show of hands, please. Yes. Oh, okay. Should I say stand up if you don't agree? No, I'm not going to single you out. It's okay. I think we can say we have an overwhelming majority.
But thank you, Miranda. So Miranda has just organised a motion to apply pressure to the local council level of government, and we are pleased to have all three of our councillors here today who are our representatives. But of course the other level of government which our speakers have referred to is the state government, whose pressure and overall state planning regulations are applying the downward pressure, and really our planners are in the middle of the sandwich. As Craig said, they may actually be embarrassed by what they have to put forward. They may or may not think this is actually a good idea. They're following instructions. So I've got a motion that I would like to put to the meeting also, but to apply pressure on any candidates for the upcoming state election, because we do have that in March, and so that is our chance to really raise this as an issue in the community. So it would both serve the purpose of requiring candidates to declare their position, which would mean they'd have to ask their party if they did have a party behind them, but also in terms of we've got to keep raising awareness of this in the community, because the draft LEP is probably not going to be up for final comment till very end of this year, or quite possibly it'll drift into next year. So this is my motion. which is very similar to Miranda's, slightly different at the end. This meeting strongly objects to the proposed reduction of properties in conservation zones in the area of Northern Beaches Council, particularly in Pittwater Ward. Rezoning will enable a greater level of development and consequent reduction in native flora and fauna, green space and the unique character of Pittwater area. We ask that all candidates for Pittwater in the coming state election declare their position on 1. The proposed changes to conservation zones. 2. A scenic foreshore protection area. 3. What planning controls they support to address our concerns.
Thanks, Julie. So we'll do this process again. Show of hands. Who's seconded? Seconded.
I know that between Councillor Causey, myself and Councillor Genscher, the number one priority we have in respect to Pittwater is preserving the natural character of our area. And so we will do whatever it takes to ensure that that remains the case. And I appreciate all your feedback on this, because this document was put out there for the very number one bullet point which appeared there on the first slide today, which was community consultation. And I think your views that you've expressed today via email, phone call, text message and various other methods is pretty clear, and so I thank you for doing that. The other point I'll make is there's a motion for Council's meeting on Tuesday night where I'm proposing, with hopefully the support of Council, to extend the consultation on this process from 31 October to 3 December. So I'm hopeful that will pass to give you the time you need to go through it so that we get it right. But can I assure you that from my perspective, and I know from the other council's perspective, we want to do everything we can to make what is great about this area continue to be great. So I actually have to leave now because I'm running late for a fire brigade overnight duty up at Terry Hills I've got to get to. So thank you so much for coming, and thank you to the organisers for putting it together. I do appreciate it, John.
I'd like to ask you one thing. I don't believe a word you say. I don't believe that you have the interests of the Pittwater area at heart when you're talking about you are talking about the Northern Beaches Council. And my point is that the loss of Pittwater Council is directly associated with the loss of your environment.
I'd like to take you back to earlier in the days of Pittwater Council when there was a developer's rush to get into dual locks because they could be strata titled, and that meant that there was on a 600 and 700 metre block, no, or even less, an equivalent sized house could be built to the one that was existing. So it was developers' paradise. And Pittwater Council, fearing that, passed a resolution that prohibited strata subdivision of dual locks. Didn't prohibit dual locks, but prohibited subdivision. And as a consequence of that, there was over 300 applications before the council in the time, and they melted like snow on the desert. Once the review is finished, allow strata subdivision of dual locks, you will see developers and development taking off like a rocket. And I think that it's something for us to be very, very careful of. Thank you.
The loss of Pittwater Council is directly relevant to the loss of our natural environment as we're seeing it happening now. And I wondered if you could offer some insight into it.
Look, it's hard for me to comment with great knowledge on those very specific local issues and questions. I think, in general, I think the amalgamation of councils has been probably not a very good thing. Certainly, in some cases like Parramatta, it's been destructive. But I'm not sure that bigger councils necessarily are bad things. I think it's really important for local councils to exercise their planning powers and to listen to their communities. But I don't honestly, it's a conundrum, because obviously a small council can be more responsive to particular local needs, but equally obviously a bigger council is capable of being more strategic and in that sense more sensible. So I think in the end it comes down to whether or not you get good people or bad people running the show, to be honest. Nevertheless, it may be that if Pittwater Council had been maintained in exactly the same way, there would have been more protections. I think it's very difficult to argue though. But the obvious answer is, you have to get elected. I mean, get noisy, go and be part of the process, lobby your local council, turn up to council meetings en masse, intimidate them. That's what, if you really want something, you really have to be present and make a lot of noise, I think.
Can I make a comment on that, please? Yeah. So, Mossman was subject to forced amalgamation in the same way that Pittwater was subject to forced amalgamation. Mossman went to court. Mossman stayed independent. I don't completely agree with Elizabeth on this point, because I think that local government is about the local community. It's about empowering you. It's about empowering your community. If you're part of a big council, you have a smaller voice, and you are part of a much bigger picture, a smaller part of a bigger picture. And I guess that the only time when I see that big councils work is when they've got a hell of a lot of money, and they can spend that money not only on sort of meeting the needs of different communities, but also on the enormous cost of engagement, right? Because actually just getting your voice heard is much more difficult when you're part of a forcibly amalgamated council. Thank you.
It's a quick question. I feel it's been a bit disingenuous of council to release this huge document. There's so much information, it's so hard to digest. It's going to be very difficult to put the genie back in the bottle. So they've released all these hot pink areas where it's going to change from C4 to R2 or residential, whatever that means. And now people are thinking, I have this huge windfall if you're changing over and you're pro-development. Is it going to be possible to revert? Is the council going to be able, I should ask Councillor Genscher or Sue to answer that. Will they just say, oh, we've made a mistake, we'll take all these off the table? I just don't understand how they're going to do that. Thanks.
Well, I think the way to do it, in my opinion, is to have, they base this whole review on the criteria. Now, the criteria have not been signed off by the state government, and I might ask this group to have a resolution. If we can change 3 of the criteria from a weighting of 0.5 to a weighting of 1, then I believe that most of the proposed R2 zonings, well, likely R2 zonings, who knows, will have to stay as a conservation zone, because the whole paper review is based on the criteria. That's how they've decided. Now, put your hands up if you agree with me. The council criteria are medium environmental criteria. I personally consider these should be high environmental criteria, because if they're high, then we will maintain our conservation zones. Number 1, biodiversity corridor and urban tree canopy. Council considers a medium environmental, or their consultants' criteria. Now, I consider that high. How can hands up, please? Okay. So if we can change the criteria, then that flows through to their reasoning of where that area goes. Number 2, they consider medium environmental criteria, ridgeline or escarpment. Now, medium or high? High. Okay, so they go into that, they get 1. That knocks out all those properties. Okay, the next one is geotechnical planning class. C3 Hawkesbury sandstone with slope greater than 25 degrees. C5 Narrabeen group with slope greater than 15 degrees. They have this in medium environmental criteria, value criteria. I consider this should be in hazard criteria. This is geotechnical, different levels, but as far as I'm concerned, this needs to be moved to the hazard criteria.
Yes.
Okay, all agree? So if we can ask council to change their criteria, they want feedback, that will flow through to the whole, to every property that they've looked at will have to be reviewed, because the criteria, which is the first point of your review, that's what they've based their changes on.
I'm just going to say another thing, supporting Sue, because I think, as we can see, this review looks at the place property by property, and we live in a whole landscape where we love our biodiversity and we love our tree cover, and I think the idea about what a fauna corridor is just basically seriously misunderstood, because we need to enable fauna and plants as well to be able to move right through the landscape, and their idea is a very, very narrow one, and whatever the permissible uses of a residential zone might become, it's likely that trees and other vegetation is going to be lost, and with them go fauna corridors. And we're not thinking of a little passage, we're thinking of great swathes of vegetation through the landscape, mostly native we hope, and not all, and the term fauna is a very broad one, and it includes creatures from threatened powerful owls right down to invertebrates, little moths and flies. They're all important. And the threatened species, which seem to get all the glamour, they rely on other species to survive. So if they're prey animals, if the powerful owl's prey animal, mostly possums or the fruit bats, as you know, if they're gone, so are the powerful owls. I mean, this is, any idiot can see that. So that's why I'm supporting Sue's changes to the criteria. Very important.